The SS never discovered that a blind teenager led a French resistance network. Jacques Lusseyran, March 1943, 11:15 a.m., Rue de la Glacière, Paris, France. Sturmbannführer Otto Brandt studied the list of captured members of Défense de la France, one of the most effective resistance networks in occupied Paris. 53 names, 53 arrests in the last 2 weeks. The network was being dismantled, step by step. But one detail kept frustrating Brandt. Interrogation reports described an unusually sophisticated organizational structure, exceptional coordination, selective recruitment that had kept the network alive for 2 years. Someone extraordinarily capable had built it. Someone they still hadn't identified. Who handled recruitment? Brandt asked the prisoner under interrogation. I don't know his real name, the man replied, his face swollen from blows. I only know he was young, very young, and no one could lie to him. He could spot infiltrators instantly. Brandt wrote it down. A young recruiter with an uncanny instinct for deception, a valuable lead. What Brandt didn't know, what he wouldn't learn until after the war, when he read published memoirs, was that the young recruiter who had built a resistance network so effective it took months to crush was Jacques Lusseyran, 18 years old. And the reason he could detect lies with impossible accuracy was simple. He was completely blind, and he had learned to see people through their voices, their presence, the energy they carried. The Nazis looked for suspects with exceptional eyesight. They never considered that the key figure might be someone with no sight at all. This is the story of how a blind teenager became a pillar of the French resistance, how physical darkness gave him a moral clarity others lacked, and how a disability dismissed as weakness became a tactical advantage against Nazi occupation. Blindness. Jacques Lusseyran was born on September 19, 1924, in Paris. He was a normal child, healthy, curious, with perfect vision, until May 3, 1932, 8 days before his 8th birthday. That day, during recess at school, Jacques ran toward his classroom. Another student, running the opposite way, collided with him. Jacques pitched forward, his face striking the sharp corner of the teacher's desk. The impact was precise and devastating. The edge pierced his right eye, destroying it instantly. The trauma was so severe that infection spread quickly to the left eye. Doctors attempted multiple surgeries to save it, but the infection was relentless. 3 weeks after the accident, Jacques Lusseyran was completely blind. At 8 years old, his visual world vanished forever. For most children, that would have been a tragedy defining life as pure loss. For Jacques, it became a transformation, one that revealed capacities he would never have discovered with sight. Years later, in his autobiography, And There Was Light, Jacques described the days immediately after losing his vision. The first thing I discovered was that losing my sight did not mean being in darkness. The darkness people imagine when they close their eyes is not what the blind experience. There is a different light, an inner light. When I stopped looking for light with my eyes, I found it within me. He developed what he called an inner vision, not in a mystical sense, but in a deeply practical one. Deprived of visual input, his brain dramatically amplified other senses. He could hear tiny shifts in tone that exposed hidden emotion. He could sense the presence of people in a room, their movement, their emotional state, with an accuracy that amazed those around him. More than that, Jacques discovered he could see truth in ways sighted people often couldn't. When someone lied, he noticed microscopic changes in voice, breathing, and physical presence. signals invisible to the eyes, but obvious to his sharpened perception. That skill, that refined through adolescence, would become his most valuable contribution to the resistance. The education of a blind boy. Jacques' parents, initially devastated, made a crucial decision. They would not treat him as an invalid. They enrolled him in a regular school, not a special institution for the blind. They demanded he meet the same academic standards as sighted students. It looked like cruelty. It became an extraordinary gift. Jacques was forced to adapt, to compete, to prove that blindness did not mean incapacity. He learned Braille quickly, reading at a speed that would eventually surpass many sighted classmates. He memorized entire lessons after hearing them once. He built three-dimensional mental maps of spaces so detailed he could move without assistance. But his greatest gift was social. Jacques had a magnetic charisma. He formed deep friendships based on authentic emotional connection rather than superficial appearance. By 15, he was a natural leader at school, natural, respected by teachers and classmates alike. That leadership showed dramatically when, at 16, he formed an informal study group that evolved into a discussion circle on literature, philosophy, and politics. 15 students gathered weekly in Jacques' apartment, debating ideas, sharing books, shaping an intellectual worldview. Without realizing it, Jacques was training for what would come next. On June 14, 1940, German troops marched down the Champs-Élysées. Paris fell with little military resistance. The occupation began. Jacques was 15. He listened to radio reports with growing horror. He heard adult conversations full of defeat and resignation. And with the clear moral certainty of a teenager who has not yet learned cynicism, he decided that occupation was unacceptable and must be resisted. "I could not see the German soldiers," he wrote later, "but I could feel their presence in the streets of Paris. They changed the air itself. Paris smelled different, sounded different. It was as if the whole city was breathing." The birth of a resistance. In the fall of 1940, Jacques and his circle of friends debated what to do. Most French people accepted occupation passively. The Vichy government collaborated actively. Organized resistance barely existed. "We have to do something," Jacques said during a meeting in November 1940. "We can't just accept this." "What can we do?" asked one friend, Philippe. "We're students. We're children. We can resist." Jacques replied simply. "We can refuse to collaborate. We can help the persecuted. We can spread truth instead of Nazi propaganda." It was teenage naivete. It was also exactly the kind of naivete that builds resistance movements. In December 1940, the group formalized. They called themselves Volontaires de la Liberté, Volunteers of Freedom. 8 members at first, all students between 16 and 18. Their first act was to print and distribute anti-Nazi leaflets in the Latin Quarter. The leaflets were rough, mimeographed on a stolen machine, delivered by hand into mailboxes and cafes. But they carried symbolic defiance. Paris would not accept occupation in silence. In spring 1941, Volontaires de la Liberté was contacted by a larger group, Défense de la France. This network, formed by university students and professors, published an underground newspaper of the same name, distributed across occupied Paris. Its leader, Philippe Viennet, 24 years old, was impressed by Jacques' group, especially by Jacques himself. "We need people who can recruit," Viennet said. "People who can tell who's trustworthy and who might be a Nazi infiltrator. That's our greatest weakness. One infiltrator can destroy the entire network." "Jacques can do it," Philippe, Jacques' friend, said without hesitation. Vianney looked at Jacques and only then truly noticed his blindness. How? I can listen, Jacques answered. I can feel. When someone lies, I know. Vianney was skeptical, but desperate. The network was expanding rapidly. They needed an effective recruiter. He decided to give Jacques a chance. It was a decision that saved the network again and again, until the weight of Nazi efficiency finally caught up. The recruiter Jacques' job was to interview potential recruits and judge whether they were genuine or infiltrators. It was an extraordinary responsibility for a 17-year-old. Yet, he performed it with a skill that seemed almost supernatural. His method was simple: conversation. He invited potential recruits to a cafe and chatted casually about politics, literature, life under occupation. While they spoke, Jacques read them with every sense except sight. He listened for micro-fluctuations in voice. Vocal tension hinted at the stress of lying. Breathing rhythms revealed anxiety. Pauses before answering suggested calculation rather than spontaneous honesty. He sensed physical presence. Jacques described it as light or shadow people carried, not literally, but as a metaphor for coherence. Genuine people radiated warmth and alignment between what they said and what they felt. Infiltrators radiated discord, a mismatch between words and inner reality. Years later, he wrote, "Sighted people trust appearances too much. Someone can look honest, act honest, and still feel dishonest. That discord is invisible to the eyes, but obvious to other senses. My blindness forced me to develop those senses. I had no choice but to trust them." The results were astonishing. From 1941 to 1943, Jacques interviewed about 200 potential recruits. He accepted 150 and rejected 50. Later, resistance investigations revealed that at least 15 of the 50 rejected were Nazi infiltrators or collaborators trying to penetrate the network. Jacques had identified them with near-perfect accuracy. Of the 150 accepted, none proved to be a traitor. 0. An impossible statistic achieved by a blind teenager who simply listened more carefully than anyone else. The operations of Défense de la France. By 1942, Défense de la France was among the most effective resistance networks in Paris. They published an underground newspaper with a circulation of 100,000 copies a month. They supplied forged documents to persecuted Jews. They hid downed Allied pilots. They coordinated small-scale sabotage of German infrastructure. Jacques, now 18, was responsible not only for recruitment, but also for organizing resistance cells. He structured the network into compartments. Each cell knew only its immediate members, not the full network. If one cell was captured, it could not betray the others. It was operational security, implemented with obsessive discipline. Jacques insisted on code names, rotating meeting locations, and never more than 3 people meeting at the same time in one place. "The Nazis are efficient," Jacques would say. "Our only advantage is being more careful than they are efficient." But Nazi efficiency eventually caught up. In the winter of 1942 to 1943, the Gestapo intensified its hunt. They had seized copies of the newspaper, tracked distribution routes, identified patterns. They knew the network operated heavily among students in the Latin Quarter. Arrests began. A captured member gave names under torture. Those names led to more arrests. The network began to unravel. Jacques sensed the danger before many others. "We have to evacuate," he argued in leadership meetings. "The pressure is rising. They're closing in." But there was debate. Evacuating meant temporarily stopping the newspaper, interrupting operations that saved lives. Was it worth sacrificing effectiveness for security? They chose to continue operating, increasing precautions but not evacuating. It was a fatal decision. Captured July 20th, 1943, 6:47 a.m. Jacques was asleep in his parents' apartment on Rue de la Glacière when the door was smashed in. Gestapo agents stormed the home and arrested Jacques and his parents. Jacques Lusseyran, the lead officer, announced, "You are under arrest for activities against the German Reich." Disoriented, Jacques asked, "What am I accused of?" Membership in the terrorist organization Défense de la France, distribution of illegal propaganda, assisting enemies of the Reich. They took Jacques to Fresnes prison, where the Gestapo interrogated political prisoners. His parents were released after brief questioning. They did not know about their son's resistance work. At Fresnes, Jacques was placed in a solitary cell. About 2 meters by 3 meters, no window, a metal bed, a bucket. For a sighted person, it was crushing darkness. For Jacques, who lived in darkness permanently, it was paradoxically less disorienting than it was for others. "I could navigate my cell easily," he later wrote. "I memorized every inch within minutes. Other prisoners stumbled at night. For me, night and day were identical." Interrogations began the next day. Sturmbannführer Brandt interrogated Jacques personally, intrigued by this blind teenager linked to a sophisticated resistance network. "What was your role in Défense de la France?" Brandt asked. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jacques replied. "You were found with the organization's materials." "That's false." And it was. Jacques had been careful never to keep incriminating documents. Brandt studied him and noted the obvious blindness. "What can a blind boy do in a resistance network?" "Nothing," Jacques said, "which is why there must be a mistake." It was a convincing performance. Jacques used his blindness as a shield, allowing Brandt to assume disability meant incapacity. But Brandt wasn't stupid. "Other prisoners have mentioned you. They say you were an important recruiter, that you evaluated new members." "Impossible. I'm blind. How could I evaluate anyone?" Brandt had no answer. That was precisely why Jacques was so dangerous. No one imagined a blind teenager could be the best judge of character in the network. Interrogations continued for weeks. Brandt applied psychological pressure but avoided severe physical torture. Jacques was young, blind, and seemed peripheral. He did not appear worth the effort. Yet Jacques was not released. He remained in Fresnes as the Gestapo dismantled the rest of the network. By August 1943, 53 members had been arrested. The network collapsed, the newspaper stopped, operations fell apart. In September 1943, the Gestapo decided their fate. Most would be sent to German concentration camps. Jacques, because of his age and blindness, was initially considered for release. But at the last moment, he was added to the deportation list. The Nazis decided that even a blind teenage prisoner deserved a camp if he had been involved in resistance. On January 22, 1944, Jacques was packed into a cattle car with other political prisoners. Destination: Buchenwald. Buchenwald. The transport took 3 days. Unheated cattle cars, little food, no sanitation. When they arrived, the temperature was -15 degrees Celsius. Prisoners were forced to stand for hours in roll call while processing began. Jacques had a small advantage. He could not see the visual horror of Buchenwald, the watchtowers, barbed wire, the crematorium, but he could smell the constant stench of burning. He could feel the fear radiating from veteran prisoners. He could hear distant screams from punishments. "Buchenwald was hell," he wrote later. but a hell I experienced differently. My darkness was full of sounds, smells, and sensations that revealed the truth of the place more directly than sight might have. He was assigned to Block 56, a barrack for French political prisoners. Here, his blindness was both a deadly disadvantage and a strange advantage. Disadvantage. Forced labor was nearly impossible. Prisoners were assigned to construction, quarrying, and other tasks requiring sight. Jacques could not perform efficiently, making him vulnerable to selection and execution. The Nazis routinely eliminated unproductive prisoners. Advantage. French prisoners protected him. They formed a support network, sharing food, guiding him, finding tasks where blindness was not instantly fatal. Maurice Vanigno, a French political prisoner who became Jacques' close friend, later said, "Jacques was unique in Buchenwald. His blindness should have condemned him. But there was something in him, charisma, presence, that made others want to protect him. It wasn't pity. It was respect. He radiated dignity, even in conditions designed to destroy dignity." Jacques survived by developing a unique role. He became a confidant, an emotional counselor for other prisoners. Men who could not share despair with anyone else spoke to Jacques. His inability to see their faces freed them from pretense. They could be vulnerable with him in ways they could not with others. "I became an unofficial confessor," he wrote. "Men told me their fears, regrets, hopes. My blindness created intimacy. I could not judge by appearances because I could not see appearances. I could only judge by the person's essence. And that essence, freed from visual judgment, revealed itself more honestly. That web of human connection saved him repeatedly. When he was too weak to work, others covered for him. When he was sick, they shared precious medicine. When selections came, prisoners hid him or bribed capos to keep his name off lists. Jacques survived not because he was physically stronger, but because he built a network of humanity inside a machine designed to destroy humanity. Liberation. On April 11, 1945, American tanks reached Buchenwald. SS guards had fled days earlier. About 21,000 survivors out of roughly 250,000 who had passed through emerged. Jacques weighed 35 kilograms at liberation, having lost half his body weight. He was weak, ill, traumatized, but alive. "Liberation was strange," he wrote. "I had imagined freedom as light. But for me, freedom sounded like American voices speaking English, smelled like real food, felt like the absence of constant fear." He was transferred to a hospital in France. It took months to regain weight and strength, years to recover psychologically. He never recovered completely, carrying Buchenwald with him for the rest of his life. But unlike many survivors who could not speak about what happened, Jacques eventually wrote about it in depth. His autobiography, And There Was Light, published in 1953, became one of the most profound testimonies of occupation and camp life. After the war. After recovery, Jacques finished university and eventually earned a doctorate in French literature. He taught at universities in France and the United States. He married, had a family, lived a life that looked ordinary on the surface. But nothing about him was ordinary. Blindness, resistance, Buchenwald. These experiences made him a witness whose perception transcended sight. In his writings and lectures, Jacques argued that blindness was not simply a disability, but a different way of perceiving reality. Sighted people rely so much on their eyes that they forget to use their other senses. They forget to hear truth in voices, to feel honesty in presence, to perceive a person's essence beyond superficial appearances. This idea resonated powerfully when he spoke of the resistance. The Nazis were masters of appearances, he said. Perfect uniforms, synchronized marches, visual propaganda designed to intimidate and deceive. But I could not see their appearances. I could only sense their essence. And their essence was moral emptiness, violence, hatred that cannot be disguised in ways my senses could not detect. Jacques died on July 27, 1971, in a car accident at only 46. A tragic loss of a uniquely important voice. Legacy. Jacques Lusseyran's story challenges assumptions about disability, ability, and heroism. In conventional narratives, blindness is a tragedy to overcome. In Jacques' story, blindness became a tool, an advantage, a source of rare perception that saved lives. The numbers support it. Over 2 years recruiting for Défense de la France, Jacques never accepted a Nazi infiltrator. Error rate, 0. It wasn't luck. It was a skill forged by blindness, by a forced reliance on signals sight often ignores. His story also reveals an uncomfortable truth about resistance. It often depended on people society underestimated, those labeled weak or marginal. Jacques, blind and a teenager. Others like Corey ten Boom, a middle-aged unmarried watchmaker. The Nazis searched for enemies who matched their image of strength. Soldiers, adult men, people capable by conventional standards. They didn't look for a blind teenager in a cafe. And in that underestimation, they lost. Epilogue. What darkness reveals. In a 1969 lecture, 2 years before his death, Jacques was asked, "If you could have your sight back, would you want it?" His answer surprised the audience. "I don't know. My blindness taught me to see things that sighted people cannot see. It taught me to perceive truth, to feel the essence of people, to experience reality without the distraction of appearances." Did I lose something when I lost my sight? Yes. Did I gain something too? Absolutely. During the war, he continued, my blindness saved lives because it allowed me to see truths others didn't. I could identify infiltrators others accepted because their appearances were convincing. I could sense who was genuine and who was acting, not because I was special, but because my blindness forced me to perceive differently. The lesson is not that blindness is good. The lesson is that what society calls disability often reveals capacities we might never develop otherwise. My blindness disabled me in many ways. It also gave me perceptions that saved lives. He paused, then added, "The Nazis built a system based on appearances, uniforms, symbols, visual displays of power. It was designed to impress and terrify people who could see. But I could not see. I could only feel. And what I felt was moral emptiness disguised as spectacle. That clarity, born of darkness, allowed me to resist in ways I might not have been able to if I had sight." The last word belongs to Philippe Vianney, the leader of Défense de la France, who survived the war and wrote about Jacques in 1970. Jacques Lusseyran was the most effective recruiter we had, not because he had special training or experience, but because his blindness trained him in a perception beyond sight. He could see truth with a clarity impossible for those of us who relied on our eyes. The Nazis never understood how a blind teenager could be a threat. But Jacques was not a threat despite his blindness. He was a threat because of it. His darkness gave him a light they could not extinguish. When we remember the resistance, we must remember that heroism does not always look the way we expect. Sometimes it looks like a blind teenager sitting in a cafe, listening carefully, perceiving truths others cannot see. Jacques taught us that darkness can reveal what light hides. The Nazis depended on a spectacle of light, bright uniforms, banners, visual symbolism designed to dominate. Jacques lived in permanent darkness, and in that darkness, he perceived a moral clarity that dismantled their spectacle. That is the lesson we must keep. Apparent weakness can be hidden strength. Disability can develop unique capacities, and blindness, in the right circumstances, can see more clearly than 1,000 eyes. Jacques Lusseyran lost his sight at 8. He built a resistance network at 17. He survived Buchenwald at 20. He taught the world that darkness can illuminate truths light conceals. The SS never discovered that a blind teenager led recruitment because they could not imagine blindness as an advantage. That bias cost them because Jacques saved hundreds by identifying infiltrators who would have destroyed the network. And in that failure of imagination, this inability to see beyond appearances, the Nazis revealed their own blindness, a moral inability to recognize that human worth transcends physical capacity. Jacques saw that clearly, because he lived in darkness that revealed a light impossible to see any other way.